Good evening, everyone. And on behalf of the American Center in Moscow, I'd like to thank you all for coming and to this poetry event today. My name is Amira Tlkhanova, and I'm a literary enthusiast from Moscow, Russia. Today, I'm delighted to host a reading by the amazing poet Elise Foerster. Elise Foerster is an author of 3 books of poetry, The Maybe Bird, Raft in the Afterweather, and Leaving Tulsa, and served as the associate editor of When the Light of the World was Subdued. Our song came through a Norton Anthology of Native Nations poetry. She was a Wallace Stegner Fellow in the Poetry at Stanford University and holds a PhD in literary arts from the University of Denver. She teaches creative writing and literature and works in nonprofit administration for various arts and literary organizations. Foerster grew up living internationally, is of European and Muskogee descent, and is a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. She lives in San Francisco. And tonight, Jennifer is going to read her poems to us for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll get a chance to ask some questions. You can drop them in the chat, and I'll be happy to read them out to Jennifer. I just want to let you know also that our team at AC has posted on social media a link to the poems that will be read tonight, accompanied by the side-by-side Russian translation, so you can read along. And Jennifer, welcome to Meet a Poet.
Thank you so much, Samira. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you to the American Center of Moscow for bringing me here. I'm calling in from San Francisco, California. So it's early in the morning here, 8 a.m. The sun came up just recently. It's really good to be here with you, and thank you for asking me to read some poems for you today. So should I get started, Samira?
Absolutely. You can get started. Go ahead.
Okay, great. All right. So I'm going to start reading from my first book, Leaving Tulsa. So as Samira mentioned, I'm from the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. I'm a tribal member. But I grew up living internationally. My father worked in the embassy, and so I lived in Austria and Belgium when I was a kid, but we would go back to Oklahoma often in the summertime. So I grew up always feeling like I was going home and leaving again. And so when I was in my 20s, I started going back to Oklahoma frequently and spending time with my grandparents. And I would live in New Mexico, so I would drive to Tulsa and then leave and come back. And I was always going back and forth. So that's why I titled the book Leaving Tulsa. I always felt like I was having to leave a place. So this first poem from Leaving Tulsa is called Relic. An atlas on the underside of my dream. My half-shut eyelid, a black wing. I dipped sharp quills in the night's mouth. Moths swarmed from my throat. I pulled a feather blanket over my skeleton and woke. A map of America flapping in the dark. Once I dreamt of inheriting this. My mother, who still follows crows through the field. My sister's small hand tucked inside hers. Me on her breast in a burial quilt. Flight. As a child, I tossed all my imaginary friends out the window of a fast-moving train because I wanted to feel my fist break open as I freed them, as each of their bodies whipped against the siding, their insides, snow dispersing into wind, their little heads rolling across the yellow plains. Because I believed they would return, but none have since. Not even the ones I didn't love. This is called The Other Side. I mention Vienna, Austria in this poem. It's written about the time that I lived in Vienna when I was about 11 years old to 15 or 16 years old. And I went back there several years ago, or maybe when this poem, about 10 years ago. And I wrote this poem there. I was trying to remember who I was when I lived there. And if I became the person I thought I would at that time. The other side. My crown, my room, surrounding snow. These are not my hands, my winter shoes carried off by uncertain music. There was a meadow behind my house, and if I should see myself there, she would tell me there was never a meadow, and then walk through me as if through a cloud, and carry on in her own solitary direction. Crows still caw in her palace garden. Tram rails, rain, stammering moon. Once lilacs bloomed their huge white knuckles, breaking the winter of my room. It was a dream. French windows on a Viennese street. Every street I cross, angling alongside smoggy post-war artifices, branches scratch against my sleep. How my body was a branch in my sleep. And when I woke years later, I peered down upon it, leafless and stiff. No roosts left, no caw, no birds blooming in the dream's green crooks. Afternoons alone are labyrinthine. I wander the city, searching for what? Friends. We knew where to find each other, tapping the window of the winter room. We were thinner then, younger than the chestnut trees. Everything has its seed much later and on the other side of time. This poem is called River. If a sparrow were to sleep in a depression in the ground, does it dream of the river moving beneath it? If a woman were to sleep in the sparrow's breast, a sparrow sleeps in a depression in the ground. If a woman were to curl her body around it, she would no longer dream of the river. They were walking in the reeds along the river bank. The river they were moving toward was moving backward. She asked, "What if we were to dream each moment before us as we dream each moment behind us?" They were walking in the reeds along the riverbank. Said the deer, "It will feel like flying." If the sparrow were to sleep in the woman's breast, if the woman were to lie where the deer had lain their dreams' depressions in the matted grass, watching the river, is she made of grass? She is talking with the deer on the riverbank, or the sparrow perched in the reeds. She asks as if time were a question. She asks, "Will it feel like flying?" In a trench lined with asters, new shoots of blue stem, her dreams are the shape of a question. Her body, the dream of the river. She says it will feel like flying, watching the waves pull against time. She is made of time. And she dreams of the deer who shaped the trench, watches the sparrow fall from the sky. So these poems, the last few that I've read, are from my second book called Bright Raft in the Afterweather, which came out in 2018. This one as well, it's called Apricots. A light, a room, lakes upon lakes. The hen's head, blazing, drops to the mat. I want to sleep in the straw through the slant afternoon, my own head, a bowl of apricots. Were the blood tracks on the forested overpass not the antelopes? Were the thunder clouds in my belly not the dark strokes of men? There is no man in a tower with a stopwatch. Tonight, no moon to break myself against. A light, a boat, unlit room. Don't sleep yet. I'm rowing toward you. When I was working on this second book, I had moved to San Francisco, California. And this was the furthest west on the continent that I'd lived. I'd never seen the Pacific Ocean before I moved here. So many of the poems in this book were inspired by a woman that I saw or imagined I saw named Hokdalwa. And Hokdalwa in Muskogee language is an elderly woman, like a grandmother kind of figure. And these poems are really inspired by her, whom I saw or would see all over the city, an apparition on the beach. So this is a poem that features the beach. The Last Kingdom. 3 days before the hurricane, a woman in white is hauling milk. The beach wails, she is swinging her pail. I am sleeping in a tent of car parts, quilts, when the woman passes through the heavy felt door. If your dream were to wash over the village, she says. We listen, seagulls resisting the shore. Hermit crabs scuttle under tin. The children hitch their sails in. Later that night from the compound walls, I see her hitchhiking the stars' tar road. Black dress, black boots, black bonnet, a moon-faced baby in a basket. Thus, alone, I have conceived. A tent dweller moved to the earth's edge. I bathe in acidic waves. Everyone in the village watches at the cliff, the tidal wave breach roll across the sky. They are feasting on cold fried chicken, champagne. I have no dancing dress for the picnic. The king dozes in his gravelly castle. The band plays its tired refrain. Men drunk on loosened wind raise their cups to mechanical dolphins tearing through the sheet metal sea. In the shadow of petrel's snowy specters, drifting monuments crash and calve. But I, as water under wind does, I tear my hair, scalp the sand. The sun, eclipsed by dark contractions, turns its disk to night. Fish, like bright coins, flip from my hand. Waking, I find I am alone in the kingdom. The moon lays upon me its phosphorescent veil. The floating world, luciferous. Bleached coral coliseum, a mermaid's molten gown. She turns her widening wheels, spills her pail of glacial milk. I could almost swim forever to her beat of frozen bells, but a sheet of water doesn't travel with the wave, and the morning like a tender body slides out of silt. I press against its damp, rough surface. An ear. This poem is called Hokdalwa's Crow, and as I said, Hokdalwa's Muskogee language for an elderly woman who's somewhat of a grandmother. Also in this poem, I do mention something about Russia, and I read once this story that took place with some ornithologists who were working with hooded crows in Russia. So that's where that line comes from. Hokdalwa's Crow. There were still songbirds then, nesting in hackberry trees, and a butterfly named Question. I remember ivy trembling at the vanishing point of your throat. Then the timelines crashed. California split into an archipelago. Orchards withered under blooms of ash. Now there is no nectar, no rotten fruit. The air is quiet. Once in Russia, ornithologists trapped a population of hooded crows, transported them 500 miles westward. Winter came. They never caught up with their flock. With crusts of calcified algae, we catalog each day lost. Hot thermals, cirrus vaults, fistfuls of warblers hurtling into dark. There was no sound to the forgetting. We knew the heart would implode before the breath and lungs collapsed, that the world would end in snow. An old woman walking alone, empty bird cage strapped to her back. So now I'm going to read a series of poems from my latest book called The Maybe Bird. And I'll give a little background about these poems before I read them. I think I have time. In this book, I wanted to do something different than I had in my other books. I wanted to follow a set of rules. So I made up some rules for myself. I decided I would write 64 poems and that I would create somewhat of a strategy for writing these poems. I wanted to write something that could track what I visually saw as a spiral or a net. So what I did is for the first poem, I used one line. I opened every line of the first poem into a new poem. So one line would be involved in the making of the other poems. And then I started taking other lines and repeating them throughout the 64 poems. And I can't really show a picture of it now, but I drew a picture of what the poems as a whole would look like if sound were visual. I wanted to create a series of echoes, basically. And I wanted the series of echoes to reenact a spiral. So these poems are titled by the line that is repeated from other poems. Probably doesn't make sense when I talk about it. So I'll proceed. 1 week away, and the forest has changed. 1 week away, and the forest has changed. Measured wind, consistent in its image. First frost, day's ghost, chattering red toothed leaves. I wander the groves of recycled thoughts, restless, navigating musty stacks, past gravel tracks, those blushing fields of wheat, golden in autumn's sweep and blossom. For an instant, I turn back and notice how the glacier at first sight is static, how a train becomes a parabola in snow, how a swamp tupelo roots in our haze. To what can we return when we turn time toward sequence, when we reset the chain to prove our lives a miracle of flight? There have been 5 mass extinctions in our 400 billion year history, and no memory of the formula for forgetting. What can we make of it but a hot air balloon? I wind the key and wait, suspended against the ruins. Restless in the channel, all I've loved. They closed the subway the afternoon our boat disappeared over the earth's edge. A cliff mistaken for dysthymia. A star's formation as sublime mirage. When the flood returned to swallow the earth, we hadn't noticed the skies unbluing. Fish slipped from blackness, flowering sun, or how hollow the sound left behind. Ocean's flocks tangled in grass. I write under tide burrowing shut. Soon they will find me, restless in the channel with all I've loved. The lightness, language, marvelous thing. By blood I encountered my formlessness, hip in Cossacks, netting the bones tender. I was changing from within the deep vein, a natural death, evolution's echo, my swallows fleet, my loom's blue-metered weft impressed upon the murmuring river. I had been critical of the music, the lightness, language, marvelous thing, feathered match coat of Spanish origin, flame in my unfashionable closet. On my crown, I can still see the future. Be mindful, you said. Prepare for change. I changed the geological record without past romantic anxiety because I wanted to understand this moment in our history. Seagulls hatching from my wrist in full sentences. I wear a dress not of time's poisoned quills. Still I sleep within my 2 bodies, a poison, wearing a quill dress of hours for our dim procession. Each day we wake to a feedback loop of anoxic oceans. Were each wave a blank page to begin with? The sound of my immaterial twin, the deafening art of repetition, tingling rush of shells against the shore's sculptured mantle, her other self plotting her reckless escape. Not yet for death would she heave her body from these waves. I become of my 2 selves the confluence. When the flood returns to swallow the earth, the day will seem a tranquil derangement. Most will gather in the interior. Those left behind will be lost together. But feathers of discontent, kingfishers. Our beginning was covered in water, and all the animals spoke the same language. Panther tracked back and forth across the sky's long escarpments, nightfall and rock mouth. Buzzard grew tired and flapped his broad wings. The soil beneath him rippled into hills. Our threads unraveled. Spiders' reins returned. Beneath the surface of the floodwaters, the lost people rubbed their faces with earth, their rutted eyes resistant roads of grain. The only willing survivors, not ghosts, the planet's oldest organisms, but feathers of discontent, kingfishers drifting wind struck over Earth's ancient vents. Sketched on their cities' chipped brass plates, our future's blinking archipelago. Wouldn't it be preferable to drown, victims of upper world explanation? There are no hard syllables in water. Our boat disappeared over the Earth's edge, and what we didn't see was paradise. A lot of these poems are deeply concerned with our climate and how we're living so out of balance with this earth that is a part of us. So that's really where these poems come out of. Ashes, it's leftover words in my mouth. The singers have fallen asleep in their cars, small camps smoldering. What they didn't sing, ashes, it's leftover words in my mouth. Where are you going? The sun, the moon? Where did you come from? Warrior, star. Yet in my doubts, I strain to hear the bubble of salt behind sand snails, the ocean pulling back into its mouth. What detritus the mind. I wade knee-deep in our stratum's mycelium, laced like splattered aluminum paint. A mat of leaves on the forest floor will receive our fall, we imagined. Before we were forced to leave, we charted the denser galaxies, trophied the antlers of 3 trillion trees to carry with us as a reminder of the history of the world's end people. There was no miracle, no other home. I look to the east, the fire roads. Marsh birds are lifting from the methane field. Dwarf white roses blooming in my suitcase. Let's see. So I have 2 more. And then I hope we can have a discussion, and I look forward to your questions. I become the canyon, its dreaming eye. In the last days of my marriage to God, I descended their spiraled library, relentlessly navigating stacks of shell-tempered mortuary offerings, sandstone saws recovered from the caves. I lingered on history's worn stone steps to write these things, to recollect myself. What had I unburied? What had I freed? And what is freedom from the human need to catalog and clock our porous loads? I gazed, eyes closed, at the moon's cratered walls. Spiders encircled me, spinning their silks, as I listened to the tuning suspension of the underground particle colliders vibrating between silence and motion. By midnight, saplings had sprouted from my hand. The clouds dissolved into semicolons, and I with them into a new language of branching gestures, airborne spores from one infinitesimal thread, a pattern. It was my first act of disappearance. I would return before anyone noticed, poems to be found in the forest, not the mind. There's a canyon between this version of me and the shadow on the stairs that is mine. I became this canyon, its dreaming eye. Of paradise, language could not take you there. The poem had no temporal defense. Abandoned, it fled its historical texts, crossed mountains, pretending time to pass. Up and down stairs, in and out of rooms, I write into oblivion, going nowhere. Pen runs out, computer dies. Are we material or electronic? Or birds of the cross seas alliances, red underwings, igniting the wheel when autumn's sweep blows in and turns inward the horizon's eyes, its ripped mouth bleeding out the burden of a forest. Paradise. Language cannot take us there. Each pass I cross, the same scene reappears. Alongside the Atlas's scribbled road, the singers have fallen asleep in their cars. An errant breeze through the foliage. Their almost imperceptible ascent. All right. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jennifer, for sharing your poetry with us tonight and for creating this wonderful atmosphere. It's really cold in Moscow at the moment, but your poetry kind of gives this wonderful, heartwarming warmth. Thank you so much. And I also,
I was noticing as I was reading, because I chose the poems, that I happened to choose all these poems. I have a lot of snow in them. I kept thinking, there's snow again. I've been repeating snow. There's a lot of snow in these poems, so I'm glad to know they weren't cold.
Oh, absolutely not. And also, I would like to remind our audience, and I'm encouraging you guys to send your questions to Jennifer, and I'll read them out loud. And Jennifer, we have the first question. Your poetry often explores themes of identity, place, and culture. How has your multicultural background and membership with the Muskogee Creek Nation influenced your work?
Thank you. I think growing up and coming out of multicultural experiences, multilinguistic experiences, and multi-tribal experiences really forms who I am and is one of the reasons I write poetry. It was really significant for me growing up mostly in Europe, and yet knowing that I'm from the United States, but I have another nation as well, the Muskogee Creek Nation. And learning about this as a kid, about having two nationalities, really, and learning about our nation and how we came to where we are today, was a really interesting way to grow up, thinking about who I am in terms of different cultures, different continents. I went to international schools when I was young, so I was often around people with different religions and different languages. So I was very comfortable in a multicultural environment. It was where I'm most comfortable, in fact.
Mhm.
And that influenced me going to college at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a multi-tribal college. I grew up internationally, but I wanted to learn about the many nations in the United States. And so going to a tribal college, I was able to learn about many other nations in this very diverse country, with a very, 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 very long, timeless history. Also learning about my own people's history, and knowing that we were forcibly removed through a period of intense ethnic cleansing in the Southeast when Andrew Jackson and, there was a big movement to go westward, and the people had to move the original people of that area out of the way. So we were moved out of the way. Many people were murdered and died, and we ended up in, they gave us a reservation in Oklahoma, where at the time it wasn't Oklahoma. It was also other tribal members, other Native people's homeland. So knowing this history also influenced a lot of my feelings about displacement and the question of home. And still today, I work with the Muskogee Nation in various capacities. I learned, in my 20s that once I was a tribal citizen, but once I was old enough to vote, I could vote in the Muskogee Nation just as well as in the United States.
Wow.
So I take that very seriously. And I think identifying as someone from the Muskogee Nation, as well as someone from the United States, as well as someone who grew up internationally. My father is from Dutch and German heritage. Those are all parts of my identity. I want to hold them all together as one, and not, privilege, or I want to take them all seriously. And I feel a very deep responsibility as a Muskogee citizen to learn the language in particular, since I am a poet and I work with language. So I have been studying Muskogee for many, many, many years. And that is also a part of influencing my poetry. So in Maybe Bird, I actually was working with some of the linguistic structures of Muskogee language. And that was some of the parameters I used while writing those poems.
Oh, that's so interesting. Actually, my next question would be like, what do you see the role of Native American poetry, like, or your poetry in promoting understanding and awareness of indigenous cultures? But you kind of like touched upon that a little bit. But still, it would be interesting. How do you see your poetry in terms of like promoting the understanding? Like, what do you want people to learn about different backgrounds or different identities, or specifically about Native American culture?
Yes.
Communities?
Well, first of all, I think it's powerful just for someone to learn, oh, there's a group of people, a culture of people who are Muskogee, and they're one of hundreds of cultural groups, Native people, tribal groups, nations that we still are very much involved and live and thrive in this country, despite the attempts of the country to erase us. So that alone is just one reason, when I was writing poetry, and I thought it does matter to identify myself as also a member of the Muskogee Nation, just so people can hear the word and know it exists, right? And just to start to begin to learn. I love our Muskogee history. We're from the southeast of this country, of this continent, with very long stories, and really evolved and fascinating, deep civilizations, I guess. But the history of the United States doesn't recognize that there were vast groups of people living very intense lives and very productive and active societies with arts and culture and language and science. And this was all here long before the colonists came. And it's really profound to me how in like 200 years, the history has managed to almost completely erase that. So that people grow up even living in the Southeast, not knowing that there were ancient civilizations there who were there up until the point and still there, and that we survived removal. So it's profound to me that people don't know this. So that's an important part of my work too, is just, at least as a Muskogee citizen, reminding people of really everything that was here before the colonists came up with their dream. But the other thing is I also am one of those, you know. I'm also an immigrant from, great-great-grandparents who were immigrants from Germany. So I am also those colonists, So that's also something I feel is important to recognize, is that many of us are multicultural people, and it's not about duality, sides. You're either this or that. You're either the colonized or the colonizer. You're either on the good or the bad side of history. Many of us are just on both, but we can choose how we live today. And so that's important to me in my work. And I am trying more and more to integrate Muskogee language into my work. My Muskogee language teacher told me that something her mother told her, that wherever you go in the world, you should say something in Muskogee. So when she first went to New York City, she stood atop the Empire State Building and shouted out in Muskogee, because she said it could be that language had never been there before. It had never been in that place. So the more we speak the language in different places, it helps it to live. I believe in language as a being as well.
I would say that you brought Muskogee language across Russia today, so that's definitely you might have been the first one.
Well, and I didn't actually read anything in Muskogee.
There were a few words. You mentioned the grandmother.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of made it here a little bit. But we would definitely love to hear more about that. There is another question from the audience. You've mentioned that nature and the environment play a significant role in your poetry. How do you connect with the natural world? How do you connect natural world with the human experience in your work?
Yeah, I think about this all the time. I teach poetry, and I'm always bringing this to the classroom, the groups of people that I work with or I teach. This question. We are so intimately connected to. We are the natural. We're an animal, and how often we forget about the many other like non-human animals and life forms. And so I struggle a lot as a poet, as I have such deep concern for all the life forms on this planet. I've always felt really more comfortable surrounded by a very vibrant natural world, less comfortable in cities, less comfortable with people. And, I used to want to really work in wildlife conservation as well. So it's an issue really deeply important to me, but I wasn't a very good scientist. So I think also as a poet, like what can poetry do? Sometimes it feels like it's going nowhere. It's not speaking to people. It's not actually helping us address our climate crisis. I worry about that a lot. And so what I do is I bring it to the students and I say, let's talk about it. Because I do actually deeply believe that poetry does help. And the reason is because poetry encourages us or requires us to learn how to listen. Not just as listeners or readers of poetry, because it slows you down. When you're reading a poem, a different kind of attention sets in and needs to. And you read it over and over again until you feel it in a different way. You listen to it. And I think if we approach our natural world with that same quality of attentive listening, we'll find that connection that we have with a tree, with the birds, with the ocean. We'll find that deep connection in the same way when we listen to a poem and at one moment we say, oh, I feel something connective here. I may not know what this poem means, but I feel something I respond to. That's a different kind of meaning making. It's not the rational mind. It's not the human mind. It's something else, something I can't put my finger on, which is maybe why I write poetry, because poetry can't explain. You can't summarize. You can't quite put your finger on it, So listening, I think listening, and poetry teaches us to listen. And that's the connection between poetry and the living world. I also do believe that language, and that's why I want to, continue to learn Muskogee and integrate that too, is that language participates with the living world as bird songs do, how we breathe and how we speak, and celebrating all of the variations of that is a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your answer. It kind of gives so much space for thought that you kind of want to live in a little bit in that kind of idea and kind of feel it through. When you were talking, I loved how you kind of wrapped your poems into the background, and there was an interesting story about you coming back to Vienna, checking if you became the person you thought you would become, if I got it right.
Yeah.
Could you tell a little bit about that experience, and also was becoming, since you kind of had a plan of you were planning to become, was becoming a poet was part of that plan, or was it kind of something that kind of came to you, or you kind of ended up being, or came naturally?
Yeah, it wasn't part of the plan. I always loved poetry, and I always loved poetry. I loved writing it. My dad used to write rhyming verses for people on their birthdays. And I loved that. I loved the music of it. I loved to read poetry. And in middle school, I had a really great teacher who gave us poetry to read. And it wasn't kids' poetry, it was the real stuff. And I found a real meaning there. So I always loved it, but I didn't think poetry was anything one could do. I wasn't around a lot of artists. My father was working with the U.S. Embassy. And so most kids I went to school with were kids of diplomats from different countries with different embassies, or their parents worked in business, and that's why they lived in Austria. Same within Belgium. We worked at NATO, so a lot of NATO people. So I was always around that kind of crowd. So I assumed when I grew up, I would have to do something in that field, right? That is likely what I would do. But I also really had this dream of working in wildlife conservation. In some capacity. It's just I didn't do very well in the sciences after all. So yeah, I didn't think, I didn't expect this. I just had a very different vision of my life, I think, when I was a kid living in Austria. And I had been invited to come back by that very same English teacher that inspired me to write poetry. He was still teaching at that school, the American International School in Vienna, Austria, and invited me to come back and teach poetry to the high school students. So I was there teaching poetry in the same place I went to school. So it felt so meaningful, like such a circle. And yet I wasn't in the place where I thought I would be. I wasn't doing the thing I thought I would be. And so there's that feeling of estrangement sometimes when we reflect back on our young selves. What would we tell ourselves? And what have I not done that I wish I had? There's a lot of things I haven't done that I thought I would. I have to accept.
That's very kind of beautiful. I thought maybe that has been the part of your teacher's plan. He was like, I'm going to spark this person with poetry, and then years later she's going to come back and give more sparks to these people.
It was great. I'm so grateful for him. Yeah.